The air in the parlour was thick with the scent of lilies and something else beneath, something sweet and rotting that no amount of flowers could mask. The curtains had been drawn against the afternoon light, and in the dim corner of the room, a man worked in silence. His hands, pale and practiced, moved across the face of the deceased with an intimacy that belonged neither to lover nor physician. He dipped his brush into a small jar of rouge, then applied it to the cheeks of the corpse with the careful attention of a portrait artist correcting a flaw. The woman on the table had been dead for 3 days. Her family waited in the room above, dressed in black, speaking in whispers about arrangements and inheritance. They did not know what happened in these hours before the viewing. They did not want to know. The undertaker worked on, positioning the jaw with wire, filling the sunken eye sockets with cotton wadding, smoothing the wax over skin that had begun to darken and collapse. Outside, London carried on, coaches rattling over cobblestones, vendors calling, children playing in the street. But here, in this housement room, lit by a single gas lamp, time had stopped. Death was being dressed for society. The undertaker stepped back, studied his wakyuk and nodded. She looked almost alive, almost peaceful, almost ready to be seen. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a voice called down softly, asking if it was time. The undertaker glanced once more at the body, then called back that it was. The viewing could begin. Chapter 1. The Trade of Shadows. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening tonight, whether tucked beneath blankets in a city apartment or settled into the darkness of a countryside room, we welcome you. What time finds you? Is it the deep hour past midnight, or that tender moment just before sleep claims you? Wherever this voice reaches you, know that you have found a place of rest, a sanctuary from the noise of the waking world. Before we begin our journey into the past, we ask a small kindness. If this channel brings you comfort, if these stories help carry you gently towards sleep, please consider subscribing. It helps us grow, helps us continue bringing you these whispered histories from the shadows of time. And if you enjoy what unfolds tonight, share it. Tell a friend, leave your thoughts below. These small gestures mean more than you might imagine. Now then, let us dim the lights. Let us close the door on the present day. Let us drift backward through the fog of years to a time when death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but lived in the very centre of the home, in the parlour, in the presence of family. To a time when certain men made their living in the space between life and the grave. To Victorian England, where the undertaker reigned over the kingdom of the dead. In the year 1837, when the young queen took her throne, England was a nation obsessed with death. It was not a morbid fascination, not entirely, but rather a practical necessity born from the simple fact that death was everywhere. Disease moved through the cramped streets of London like a living thing. Cholera claimed thousands in a matter of weeks. Tuberculosis consumed families slowly, room by room. Childbed fever took mothers. Scarlet fever took children. Workplace accidents took fathers. The average lifespan hovered somewhere in the 4th decade. And in the poorest districts, it barely reached 25. Every family knew grief intimately. Every household had buried someone. Death was not an occasional visitor, but a permanent resident, and it required management. Before the Victorian era, death had been handled by the family and the church. When someone died, the women of the household washed the body, dressed it in a shroud, and laid it out in the front room. Neighbours came to pay respects. The local carpenter built a simple coffin. The priest arranged the burial. It was a communal affair, unadorned and direct. But as the century progressed and the middle class expanded, something shifted. Wealth brought with it a desire for distance from the unpleasant realities of life, and death was chief among them. The growing industrial cities created a new kind of person, one who worked in offices rather than fields, who lived in townhouses rather than cottages, who had money to spend and a social position to maintain. These people did not want to wash bodies. They did not want to measure corpses for coffins or negotiate with gravediggers. They wanted death to be managed by professionals, handled with discretion, transformed into something respectable and even beautiful. Thus the Undertaker emerged, not as a mere tradesman, but as a kind of death merchant, a master of ceremonies who could take the chaos and horror of mortality and reshape it into something families could endure. The Undertaker was part artist, part businessman, part confidant. He arrived at the household within hours of death, moving through the front door with quiet authority, carrying with him the tools of his trade, measuring tapes, catalogues, vials of preservative compounds, bolts of black cloth. He spoke in low tones to the bereaved, asking questions about preferences and budget, about how the deceased should be remembered, about what kind of send-off would be appropriate for someone of their standing. He took control of a situation that had spiraled beyond the family's capacity to manage, and in doing so he became indispensable. The trade grew rapidly. By mid-century, every respectable neighbourhood in London had at least one undertaker, and the more fashionable districts had several competing for business. They advertised in newspapers, listing their services with the solemnity of doctors or solicitors, complete funerals arranged, mourning attire provided, embalming, available upon request, discreet service guaranteed. Some undertakers operated from storefronts with large plate glass windows displaying their wares, polished coffins lined with silk, ornate wreaths, memorial cards printed on heavy stock. Others worked from workshops tucked down narrow lanes, places the public never saw, where the actual labour of death preparation occurred away from polite eyes. The undertaker's trade required a peculiar set of skills. He needed the steady hands of a surgeon, the eye of a tailor, the tact of a diplomat, and the stomach of a soldier. He worked with bodies in various states of decay, in all seasons, in all conditions. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat accelerated decomposition, turned flesh soft and pliable, filled rooms with the thick smell of rot that no amount of flowers could disguise. Winter was kinder to preservation, but harder on the living, as frozen ground made burial difficult, and families kept bodies in unheated rooms to slow the inevitable decline. The undertaker learned to read death, to know by sight and smell how long a person had been gone, what measures would be needed, what could be salvaged of their appearance and what was beyond repair. Most undertakers had come to the trade through related professions. Many had been carpenters first, men who knew how to work with wood and measurement, who could build a coffin as easily as a cabinet. Others had been upholsterers, skilled with fabric and padding, who understood how to line a casket interior so that it cradled the body properly. Some had trained as chemists or apothecaries, bringing knowledge of preservative compounds and cosmetic preparations. A few had worked in hospitals or dissecting rooms, where they had learned anatomy and grown accustomed to handling the dead without flinching. Whatever their origin, they all shared one quality. They could look at death without turning away. They could touch cold flesh without revulsion. They could work insomnia, in dim rooms, with only corpses for company, and emerge composed and professional, ready to face the grieving family with exactly the right expression of solemn sympathy. The work was lucrative for those who built a good reputation. A full funeral for a wealthy family could cost £50 or more, nearly a year's wages for a working man. The undertaker's fee covered not just the coffin and burial plot, but everything surrounding the event. He provided the mourning clothes, the black gloves and veils and armbands that marked the family as bereaved. He supplied the horses that would draw the hearse, selecting black stallions with the right temperament and training them to walk at the proper funeral pace. He hired the mutes, professional mourners who stood at the door or walked in the procession, dressed in black cloaks and carrying staffs draped in crape. He arranged for the feathermen who would carry tall plumes of ostrich feathers, symbols of grief visible from 10 streets away. He coordinated with the church, with the cemetery, with the printer who would produce memorial cards, with the stonemason who would carve the headstone. He became the conductor of an elaborate performance, one that required perfect timing and flawless execution. But beneath the respectability, beneath the polished brass and black silk, There existed a darker side to the trade. The undertaker operated in a liminal space, neither quite gentleman or quite tradesman, handling matters that society preferred not to examine too closely. He saw things that no one else saw. He knew which families kept secrets, which deaths were not quite natural, which bodies showed signs of violence or poison or neglect. He learned to keep his observations to himself, to maintain the discretion that his clients paid for. In the basement workshops where bodies were prepared, things occurred that would have horrified the families waiting upstairs. Corpses were manipulated, altered, reconstructed. Features were reshaped. Limbs were positioned and wired into place. Cavities were filled. Surfaces were painted. The dead were made presentable through methods that bordered on the grotesque, all so that the living could bear to look at them one last time. The undertaker also navigated a complicated relationship with the church. Officially, the church still controlled burial rites and cemetery access. The priest blessed the body, led the service, committed the deceased to the ground with prayers and ritual. But in practice, the undertaker had become the true authority on death. He knew the regulations, the fees, the paperwork. He knew which gravediggers worked quickly and which needed supervision. He knew how to arrange a burial in the fashionable sections of the cemetery, where the wealthy and notable were interred beneath elaborate monuments. The priest performed the spiritual work, but the undertaker managed everything else, and both men understood this division of labour, though neither spoke of it directly. By the middle of Victoria's reign, the undertaker had become a permanent fixture of English life, as essential as the doctor or the solicitor. He attended births, for infant mortality was high, and tiny coffins were a regular part of his inventory. He attended weddings, for mourning periods had to be observed, and families needed guidance on when it was appropriate to celebrate again. He attended every death, of course, but also every commemoration, every anniversary of death, every unveiling of a monument. He was present at the most intimate moments of family life, the moments when pretense fell away and raw grief emerged. He saw people at their worst and their best, their most genuine and their most theatrical. And through it all, he maintained his professional distance, his careful neutrality, his absolute discretion. The trade had its hierarchies. At the top stood the fashionable West End undertakers who served aristocratic families, men who wore fine black suits and drove their own carriages, who employed staffs of assistants and maintained elegant premises. Below them came the respectable middle-tier undertakers of the suburbs and provincial towns, solid craftsmen who handled most of the city's funerals with competence, if not grandeur. At the bottom existed the cheap burial men of the slums, who offered basic services for a few shillings, who reused coffins when they could get away with it, who buried paupers in mass graves with no ceremony beyond a quick prayer. Every undertaker knew his place in this hierarchy, knew which clients he could pursue and which belonged to his betters. The undertaker's shop became a strange sort of theatre, a place where death was on display but sanitised, made safe for public consumption. The coffins in the window gleamed with polish, the silk linings looked soft as clouds. The memorial cards bore elegant script and comforting verses about eternal rest and heavenly reunion. Everything suggested peace, dignity, gentle sleep. Nothing suggested the reality of decomposition, the indignity of the corpse, the horror that bodies became when left unattended. The undertaker sold not just burial, but the illusion of death tamed, death controlled, death transformed into something almost beautiful. And Victorian society, desperate for that illusion, paid handsomely for it. Chapter 2. The Parlour of Preparation. The room was always in the basement. Sometimes it occupied a converted coal cellar beneath the undertaker's shop. Other times a purpose-built chamber behind the main premises, but always it was below ground, away from windows and passing eyes. The Parlour of Preparation, as it was sometimes called in polite company, though the undertakers themselves used blunter terms. The laying-out room, the dressing chamber, the cold room. Here, in this underground space lit by gas lamps that hissed and flickered, the true work began. Here the dead were transformed from what they had become into what their families needed them to be. The room smelled of carbolic acid and camphor, of lye soap and something beneath that no chemical could entirely mask. The walls were whitewashed brick, easy to clean, resistant to staining. The floor sloped slightly toward a drain in the corner, a practical consideration for the liquids that sometimes accumulated. Along one wall stood shelves holding the tools of the trade, glass bottles of various sizes, containing tinctures and compounds, rolls of cotton wadding, spools of copper wire, brushes of different sizes, containers of cosmetic preparations, jars of wax and plaster. In the centre of the room sat a wooden table, its surface scarred and stained despite regular scrubbing, slightly tilted to facilitate drainage. Upon this table the dead arrived, and upon this table they were made ready for their final public appearance. The body came wrapped in a sheet, carried down the narrow stairs by the undertaker and his assistant, manoeuvred carefully through the doorway and positioned on the table. The sheet was removed and set aside for burning, for it often carried with it the stains and odours of the deathbed. What lay beneath varied greatly depending on how long death had held dominion, and what had caused it. Some bodies arrived within hours of death, still warm to the touch, features composed, requiring only washing and dressing. Others came after days of laying out at home, where well-meaning family members had kept vigil in overheated rooms, not understanding that warmth hastened decay. These bodies posed greater challenges. The skin had begun to discolour. The features had started to sink and distort. The flesh had taken on a waxy quality, and in summer, the first signs of bloating might have appeared. The undertaker began with assessment, walking slowly around the table, observing without touching, noting what would be required. He looked at the face first, for that was what the family would see, what they would remember. Were the eyes properly closed, or had they opened slightly in the hours since death? Was the mouth set in a peaceful expression, or had the jaw fallen slack? Had the skin retained its colour, or had it paled to the grey-white of tallow? He examined the hands, checking if they had been folded across the chest or left at the sides, whether they had stiffened in position or remained pliable. He noted any visible injuries, any signs of disease, any disfigurements that would require special attention. Only after this initial examination did he begin the physical work. Washing came first. A basin of warm water was prepared, scented with lavender or rose water to mask less pleasant odours. The undertaker worked methodically, starting with the face and moving downward, using soft cloths and gentle pressure. This was not merely cleaning, but a form of massage, working the muscles and tissues, encouraging them to settle into more natural positions. The face received particular attention. The undertaker cleaned around the eyes, removing any discharge or crust. He washed the lips, working them gently to restore some colour and flexibility. He cleaned the ears, the nostrils, attending to every detail that a close viewer might notice. The hair was combed or brushed, arranged to cover any thinning or balding that might distress the family. For women, the hair was often dressed in the style they had favoured in life, pinned up or left flowing depending on age and custom. After washing came the crucial work of positioning. The body needed to look natural, peaceful, as though merely sleeping. But death did not cooperate. Rigor mortis set in within hours, stiffening the muscles, fixing the limbs in whatever position they had held. If the undertaker received the body early enough before rigor had fully established itself, he could arrange it properly and let the stiffening work in his favour. But often the body arrived already rigid, and then more aggressive measures were required. Limbs had to be manipulated, joints flexed and worked until they yielded. The undertaker applied pressure, used his weight, sometimes heard the soft crack of tendons giving way. It was physical labour, this wrestling with the dead, and it required strength as well as skill. The face presented the greatest challenge. The jaw had to be closed and kept closed, for an open mouth destroyed the illusion of peaceful sleep. Various methods existed for achieving this. The simplest involved tying a strip of cloth under the chin and over the top of the head, creating a kind of sling that held the jaw up. But this showed beneath the skin, creating an unnatural tightness that observant mourners might notice. Better to use wire, inserted through the septum and looped around the teeth. pulling the jaw into position and holding it there invisibly. Or a small wooden block could be placed in the mouth, wedged between the upper and lower teeth, forcing them together. Some undertakers injected plaster of Paris into the jaw muscles, creating an internal framework that held everything in place. Each method had its advocates, and experienced undertakers developed their own preferences based on years of trial and error. The eyes required similar attention. They needed to appear closed, lids resting gently as in sleep. But death often left the eyes partially open, showing a crescent of white beneath the lids, or caused them to sink back into the skull, creating hollow shadows. The undertaker placed small pads of cotton beneath the eyelids, pushing them outward to restore the natural curve. He might apply a touch of adhesive to keep the lids sealed, or insert caps of curved celluloid to maintain the proper shape. In cases where the eyes had sunk significantly, he filled the orbital cavities with wadding, building up the tissue beneath until the surface looked smooth and natural. Colour was the next concern. Death drained the face of warmth, left it pale and waxy and lifeless. No amount of peaceful positioning could disguise this deathly pallor, and families found it disturbing, a reminder that what they viewed was indeed a corpse and not a sleeping loved one. So the undertaker became a painter, mixing cosmetics to restore the appearance of life. He worked with rouges and powders, carefully applied to the cheeks and lips. Too much looked garish, theatrical, obviously false. Too little left the face looking corpse-like. The skill lay in achieving that middle ground, adding just enough colour to suggest blood still moving beneath the skin, warmth still radiating from within. The undertaker studied the face as an artist studied a canvas, stepping back to evaluate his work, making tiny adjustments until the effect satisfied him. For bodies that had suffered visible trauma or disease, more extensive work was required. Smallpox left pockmarks and scars, burns destroyed skin, accidents caused wounds and a missing tissue. Wasting diseases left the face gaunt and skull-like. In such cases, the undertaker employed techniques borrowed from sculptors and mask makers. He used wax to fill depressions, building up sunken areas until they had matched the surrounding tissue. He moulded features that had been damaged, recreating what death had destroyed. He applied plaster to create texture where skin had been lost. In extreme cases, he constructed entire sections of face or skull, using wire frameworks covered with wax and painted to match the remaining skin. These restorations took hours, sometimes days, and required both artistic skill and anatomical knowledge. The goal was not perfection, but plausibility, creating something the family could bear to look at, something that resembled their loved one enough to provide comfort. The body itself received less attention than the face, for it would be hidden beneath clothing and blankets, but certain preparations were necessary. Any wounds or surgical incisions had to be closed and covered. Bodily orifices were packed with cotton wadding to prevent leakage, practical measure that had to be taken regardless of how distasteful the undertaker found it. In cases where decomposition had begun, particularly in the abdomen, the undertaker might pack the body cavity with sawdust or charcoal to absorb fluids and control odour. Some undertakers injected preservative compounds, solutions of arsenic or mercury, directly into the major blood vessels, though this was not yet common practice and required specialised equipment that many could not afford. Dressing the body came last. The family usually provided clothing, the deceased's best suit or dress, or sometimes a specially purchased burial outfit. The undertaker dressed the corpse with the same care a valet or lady's maid might dress a living person, though with considerably more difficulty. The stiffness of death made simple tasks complicated. Arms had to be forced into sleeves. Heads had to be lifted to fasten collars. Buttons and hooks resisted cold, inflexible fingers. For women, the process was even more elaborate, involving corsets and petticoats and multiple layers that Victorian modesty required even for the dead. The undertaker worked patiently, adjusting and arranging, till every fold of fabric lay properly, every button fastened correctly. Shoes were put on, though they would never be seen beneath the coffin's lower panels. Jewellery was added if the family requested it. A wedding ring, a favourite brooch, a watch chain. Everything had to be exactly right, for the family would scrutinise every detail during the viewing. Once dressed, the body was positioned in its coffin, which had been lined with white silk or satin, padded to create the impression of softness and comfort. The undertaker arranged the clothing so that no wrinkles showed, placed the hands in a natural position, usually folded across the chest or abdomen, sometimes holding a Bible or flowers. He adjusted the head on its satin pillow, tilting it slightly to one side to avoid the bull, corpse in a box appearance of a body lying perfectly flat and straight. He arranged any blankets or coverings, ensuring they draped naturally. Finally, he placed flowers around the body, hothouse lilies mostly, for their heavy perfume helped mask other odours, and their waxy white petals echoed the pale perfection the undertaker had worked so hard to create. The entire process, from the body's arrival to its placement in the coffin, could take anywhere from 2 hours to 2 days depending on the condition of the corpse and the family's expectations. During this time, the undertaker worked mostly alone or with a single trusted assistant. No one else entered the preparation room. What happened there remained a professional secret, never discussed with clients, never acknowledged in polite society. The family saw only the result, their loved one lying peaceful and beautiful in silk-lined luxury, looking for all the world as though they might wake at any moment. They did not see the wires and wadding, the wax and paint, the hours of manipulation and construction that had created this illusion. They did not want to see. They paid the undertaker handsomely for his skill, but also for his silence, for his ability to take death's horror and return to them something they could bear to remember. The preparation room was where the undertaker truly earned his living, where his skill separated him from mere carpenters and coffin makers. Here he performed a kind of magic, a transformation that allowed Victorian society to maintain its careful distance from death's reality. The dead did not rot in the parlour of preparation. They did not bloat or leak or smell. They did not remind the living of their own inevitable decay. Instead, they slept peacefully, beautifully, waiting to be carried upstairs into the light, to be admired and mourned and finally released into the ground. And the undertaker, washing his hands in the basin by the door, climbing the stairs to inform the family that all was ready, carried with him the secrets of that transformation, the knowledge of what truly lay beneath the silken flowers. That knowledge was his burden, his craft, his livelihood, and he bore it in his hands, as his profession required. Chapter 3. The Art of Preservation. The summer of 1854 brought with it a heat that settled over London like a burial shroud. The Thames ran low and foul, exposing mudbanks that steamed in the August sun. In the crowded districts south of the river, the stench grew so powerful that residents kept windows shuttered despite the heat, preferring to suffocate indoors rather than breathe the corrupted air. And in those same districts, cholera moved through the narrow streets with terrible efficiency, killing hundreds within days, leaving families to dispose of bodies in a city where the ground had baked hard as stone and graveyards overflowed with the dead of previous epidemics. Undertakers worked without rest, visiting house after house where corpses waited in stifling rooms, decomposing rapidly in the heat, creating conditions that tested every preservation technique they knew. Preservation had always been the undertaker's greatest challenge, and his most valuable skill. The moment death occurred, decay began. In winter, with the body kept in an unheated room, the undertaker might have a week before visible deterioration made viewing difficult. But in summer, particularly during heat waves, he had perhaps 2 days before the process became unstoppable. Families, however, did not adjust their morning schedules to accommodate the seasons. They wanted their week of lying in state, their days of receiving condolence visits, their carefully planned funeral with all relatives summoned from distant counties. The undertaker's job was to make this possible, to hold death at bay long enough for Victorian ritual to run its proper course. The simplest method was cold. Ice, packed around the coffin or placed in containers beside the body, lowered the temperature and slowed bacterial growth. Wealthy families could afford ice delivered daily from the commercial ice houses that stored winter ice in deep underground vaults. The undertaker supervised its placement, ensuring that the melting water drained away properly, that the cold air circulated around the corpse without freezing the skin and causing discoloration. For families of more modest means, the undertaker might suggest moving the body to the coolest room in the house, usually a north-facing chamber or a basement room, and keeping windows open at night to admit cool air. In winter, bodies were sometimes placed in unheated garden sheds or coal cellars, where near freezing temperatures acted as natural refrigeration. But cold alone could not solve every problem, and many families could not afford continuous ice delivery. So undertakers developed chemical methods of preservation, techniques passed between practitioners like alchemical secrets, each man guarding his particular formulations and methods. The most common preservative was alcohol, usually in the form of spirits of wine or rectified spirits. The undertaker would saturate cloths in the alcohol and wrap them around the body, creating a barrier that killed bacteria and drew moisture from the tissues. The face received special treatment. Cotton pads soaked in alcohol were placed over the eyes and mouth, areas particularly prone to rapid decomposition. The alcohol evaporated quickly, especially in warm weather, requiring frequent reapplication, but it was inexpensive and readily available, making it the workhorse of preservation. More sophisticated undertakers used chloride of lime, a powder that could be mixed with water to create a disinfecting wash. They bathed the body in this solution, paying particular attention to the abdomen and other areas where internal decay began first. The chloride killed bacteria on the skin surface and controlled odour effectively, though it had the unfortunate side effect of bleaching the skin to an unnatural white. Some undertakers therefore used it only on areas that would be covered by clothing, preserving the natural colour of the face and hands. Others mixed the chloride with coloured tinctures to offset the bleaching effect, creating solutions that cleaned and preserved while maintaining a more lifelike appearance. Arsenic enjoyed a dark popularity among certain undertakers, particularly those dealing with wealthy clients who demanded the longest possible preservation. Arsenic solution injected into the body cavity or major blood vessels prevented bacterial growth with remarkable effectiveness. Bodies treated with arsenic could remain viewable for weeks, even in warm weather, showing little sign of decay. But arsenic was also a well-known poison, and its use by undertakers existed in a murky legal territory. A body full of arsenic could not easily be distinguished from one poisoned deliberately, which meant that undertakers who used it risked accusations if questions arose about the cause of death. Many therefore avoided it, or used it only in cases where the death was unquestionably natural and no suspicion could possibly attach. Others used it freely, trusting that their professional status would shield them from investigation, and that grieving families would not question methods that produced such excellent results. Mercury compounds offered similar preservative properties with slightly less legal danger. Corrosive sublimate, a mercury chloride solution, could be injected or applied topically to slow decay. It had the advantage of being a recognized medical compound, used by doctors for various treatments, which gave its use by undertakers a veneer of scientific respectability. The mercury worked by denaturing proteins and killing bacteria, effectively mummifying the tissues it contacted. Undertakers who used mercury regularly developed a knowledge of anatomy that rivaled that of surgeons, for they needed to know exactly where to inject their preservatives to achieve maximum effect, into which arteries, into which body cavities, at what angles and depths. The most dramatic preservation technique, though still rare in the 1850s, involved actually embalming the body by replacing its blood with preservative fluid. This method had ancient precedent. The Egyptians had practiced it thousands of years earlier, but the modern version used chemicals rather than natron and oils. The undertaker made an incision, usually in the crook of the elbow or at the base of the neck, and located a major artery. Through this artery he injected preservative solution using a hand pump or gravity-fed reservoir, forcing the fluid through the circulatory system while simultaneously draining blood from a vein. The process took hours and required steady hands, anatomical knowledge, and considerable nerve when successful. It preserved the body better than any other method, keeping tissues firm and preventing discoloration for weeks or even months. But it was expensive, technically difficult, and available only from the most skilled undertakers in major cities. Most provincial undertakers had never even seen it performed, relying instead on simpler surface treatments and hoping for cool weather. Internal packing served as another preservation strategy, particularly for bodies that had undergone post-mortem examination or that showed signs of abdominal bloating. The undertaker made a long incision, usually along the side where it would be hidden by clothing, and removed the internal organs. These were buried separately or placed in containers within the coffin. The now empty body cavity was packed with sawdust, charcoal, or a mixture of both, which absorbed any remaining fluids and prevented the collapse and distortion that occurred when organs decomposed. Over the packing went a layer of cloth soaked in preservative, and then the incision was sewn closed with heavy thread. The result was a body that held its shape, that did not bloat or leak, that could be viewed for extended periods without distressing the mourners. Cosmetic preservation, the art of making the body look alive, went hand in hand with chemical preservation. What good was a corpse that did not decay if it looked dead? The undertaker needed to maintain colour and texture as well as structure. For this he relied on various techniques, some borrowed from the theatre and others developed through his own experimentation. The face, again, received the most attention. After the initial application of rouge and powder described earlier, the undertaker might apply a thin coating of wax, carefully warmed and spread over the skin to seal in moisture and create a natural sheen. This wax layer, nearly invisible when properly applied, gave the face a lifelike quality that powder alone could not achieve. It also helped to preserve the cosmetics beneath, preventing them from fading or smearing over the days of viewing. For bodies that required longer preservation, some undertakers went further, creating what amounted to death masks in wax, applied directly to the corpse. They built up the features with successive layers of coloured wax, sculpting and shaping until the face looked not dead but sleeping, not preserved but merely resting. This technique required genuine artistry, an ability to see the person beneath the corpse and recreate that person's living appearance. The best practitioners could transform even a face ravaged by disease into something family members could bear to see, could restore beauty where death had left only horror. Such work commanded premium fees, but wealthy families paid willingly, grateful for the comfort these restorations provided. Hair and nails continued growing for some time after death, or so it appeared, though in truth the skin simply retracted, making hair and nails seem longer. Regardless of the mechanism, the undertaker had to manage this growth. Hair was trimmed and styled repeatedly during long lying-in periods. Nails were filed smooth. Facial hair on men received particular attention, for stubble appearing on a dead man's face disturbed the illusion of peaceful sleep. Some undertakers shaved the corpse daily, treating it as they might treat a living invalid. Others applied depilatory compounds to prevent growth, though these sometimes damaged the skin and required careful use. Odour control remained the greatest challenge of all. No amount of cosmetic artistry mattered if the viewing room reeked of decay. Flowers helped, hence the Victorian tradition of surrounding the coffin with elaborate floral arrangements. But flowers alone could not mask advanced decomposition. The undertaker therefore employed every trick he knew to control smell. He washed the body in strong-smelling solutions, carbolic acid, camphor, oil of wintergreen, that overpowered subtler odours. He placed dishes of chloride of lime around the room, positioned where mourners would not notice them, but where they would absorb and neutralise the gases of decay. He burned incense or aromatic pastilles, creating clouds of scented smoke that filled the air. He advised families to keep windows open, to maintain air circulation even in winter, to limit the number of people in the room at any one time, for body heat accelerated decomposition. In extreme cases, when the body had been dead for some time before the undertaker received it, when summer heat had done its worst, when preservation seemed impossible, the undertaker employed one final technique: sealing the coffin. The body was placed in its coffin, which was then closed and made airtight with pitch or wax along the joints. A glass panel was set into the coffin lid directly over the face, allowing mourners to see the deceased without opening the coffin and releasing the accumulated gases. This method admitted defeat, acknowledged that preservation had failed, but it salvaged something from the situation. The family could still have their viewing, could still see their loved one's face, even if only through glass. It was a compromise, but in the undertaker's profession, compromise often meant the difference between a successful funeral and a disaster that would damage his reputation. The undertaker's knowledge of preservation, accumulated through years of experience and shared cautiously between professionals, represented a body of practical science that existed outside official medicine. Doctors studied anatomy and disease, but they rarely handled corpses after the moment of death. The undertaker, by contrast, managed dead bodies through all stages of decay. He learned what worked and what failed, which compounds stopped rot and which merely masked it temporarily, how long each method remained effective under different conditions. This knowledge made him valuable, sometimes indispensable, but it also marked him as someone who trafficked in matters decent people preferred not to contemplate. He understood death at a level that made others uncomfortable. He could discuss decomposition as casually as a butcher discussed meat. His expertise was necessary but unsettling, respected but not quite respectable. As Victorian funeral practices grew more elaborate, the demand for preservation increased. Families wanted longer viewing periods, wanted to wait until the distant relatives arrived, wanted to display their dead in states of impossible perfection. The undertaker accommodated these demands, pushed his techniques further, experimented with new compounds and methods. He read about preservation practices from other countries, learned about the ice-based systems used in America, studied the chemical formulations published in medical journals. Some undertakers even corresponded with each other, sharing discoveries and debating techniques, creating an informal network of specialized knowledge. They were craftsmen and artists, chemists and sculptors, all in service of a single goal: making death look like sleep, making the dead look living and preserving the illusion for just long enough that families could say goodbye without confronting the full horror of mortality's physical reality. Chapter 4. The Furniture of Mourning. The coffin stood in the workshop against the far wall, its wood gleaming darkly in the gaslight. Oak, the family had specified, with brass fittings and silk lining suitable for a gentleman of standing. The undertaker ran his hand along its surface, checking for imperfections, feeling for rough spots that might have escaped the polisher's attention. The wood was smooth, the joints tight, the brass nameplate properly engraved with name and dates. It was a fine piece of work, and it would be buried in the ground within the week, sealed away forever in the dark earth. This paradox defined much of the undertaker's trade, creating objects of great beauty and expense that existed solely to be hidden from view, to decay in graves, to serve their purpose for a few days before being consigned to eternal darkness. The coffin itself was the centerpiece of Victorian death culture, but it was far from the only item the undertaker provided. Around it had grown an entire industry of mourning goods, a vast catalogue of objects specifically designed for grief. The undertaker's premises functioned as a kind of department store for death, offering everything a bereaved family might need to conduct a proper funeral and observe the appropriate mourning period afterward. Families came to his shop expecting not just burial services, but a complete mourning wardrobe, memorial items, funeral accessories, all the material paraphernalia that Victorian society required when confronting loss. Coffins themselves came in a staggering variety of designs and prices, reflecting the rigid class distinctions that Victorian England maintained even in death. At the bottom of the scale existed the pauper's coffin, Rough pine boards, barely plenned, joints held with the cheap nails, no lining beyond perhaps a scattering of wood shavings, a rope handle on each side. These cost a few shillings and were used primarily for the very poor or for those buried at parish expense. They were functional, nothing more, designed to hold a body long enough to get it into the ground. Even at this basic level, however, the coffin maintained a certain form, 6 thighs tapering from shoulders to feet, a hinged lid that could be opened for viewing. The shape itself carried symbolic weight, recognised universally as the vessel of death. A step up came the working-class coffin, still simple but with some attempt at dignity, made of better pine or perhaps cheap elm with the wood stained to darken it, lined with rough cotton fabric, fitted with iron handles instead of rope. These cost perhaps £1, a significant expense for a labourer's family, but considered necessary. No one, no matter how poor, wanted their dead buried in a pauper's box if it could be avoided. Families saved money throughout their lives specifically for funeral expenses, joining burial clubs that collected weekly pennies to ensure that when death came, as it inevitably would, at least the burial could be managed with some decency. The middle classes demanded considerably more. Their coffins were made of better woods, elm, oak or mahogany, planed smooth and polished to a high sheen. The interiors were lined with white or cream silk or satin, padded and quilted to create the impression of luxury and comfort. Brass fittings, handles, corner pieces, nameplates added weight and gleam. The lid, when opened, revealed not just fabric but careful craftsmanship, with the padding arranged in elegant patterns, with the pillow positioned just so, with every detail suggesting that the coffin was not merely a box but a piece of furniture, a fitting receptacle for a respectable person. These coffins cost anywhere from £5 to £20, depending on materials and ornamentation, representing several months' income for a clerk or shopkeeper. The wealthy, of course, went further still. Their coffins were works of art, commissioned pieces that took skilled craftsmen weeks to complete. The wood might be imported mahogany or expensive walnut, the brass fittings cast in elaborate designs, the interior lined with the finest silk from France. Some featured carved decorations, angels' heads, draped urns, wreaths of flowers, religious symbols. Others incorporated panels of different woods, creating inlaid patterns that would never be seen once the coffin entered the ground. Lead linings could be installed for additional preservation, creating a hermetically sealed chamber that would protect the body for decades or even centuries. These premium coffins cost £50 or more, small fortunes spent on objects that served their purpose for less than Mendes, a week before being buried forever. Beyond the coffin itself, the undertaker stocked a vast inventory of funeral accessories. The coffin plate, a brass or silver rectangle screwed to the lid, bore the deceased's name, dates, and sometimes a brief inscription or symbol. These plates came in dozens of designs, from simple rectangles with plain text to elaborate shields and scrolls decorated with angels, crosses, or memorial urns. The family selected the style that best reflected the deceased's station and their own grief. Coffin furniture, the handles, corner pieces, and decorative elements came in similar variety, ranging from simple irons to ornate cast brass, shaped like cherubs or draped with sculpted cloth. The nameplate served a practical function, identifying the coffin's occupant, but it also represented one of the few permanent elements of the funeral. While the coffin rotted in the ground, the brass plate endured, often surviving decades or even centuries. When old graves were disturbed for new burials, these plates were sometimes recovered and saved, becoming the only physical remnant of people long dead and forgotten. The undertaker knew this, knew that the plate he screwed to the coffin lid might be the only proof of a person's existence that survived into future centuries, and he treated its production with appropriate seriousness. Mourning clothing formed another major category of goods the undertaker supplied. Victorian mourning required specific dress, and the rules were complex and unforgiving. Women faced the most stringent requirements. Full mourning demanded black clothing exclusively, dress, shawl, bonnet, gloves, even undergarments and stockings, for a period that varied depending on the relationship to the deceased. A widow wore full black for 2 years, then gradually transitioned through stages of half-mourning that permitted grey and mauve. Other family members had shorter periods but still substantial ones. 6 months of full black for a parent, 3 months for a sibling. The undertaker stocked ready-made mourning dresses and could also connect families with seamstresses who specialised in mourning attire for those who could afford custom work. Men's mourning was simpler but still required specific items. A black suit, black hat, black gloves, a black armband worn on the left sleeve. These marked a man in mourning. The undertaker supplied these items, keeping stocks of armbands in various sizes, black gloves in multiple qualities from cheap cotton to fine kid leather. He also provided mourning stationery, black bordered writing paper and envelopes that announced grief in every letter sent. The width of the black border indicated the depth of the mourning, widening to nearly an inch for recent deaths and narrowing over time. This meant the undertaker needed to stock multiple styles, for a family might order stationery with different border widths for different family members, depending on their relationship to the deceased. Memorial cards represented one of the undertaker's most profitable sidelines. These small printed cards, distributed to funeral attendees and mailed to distant friends and relatives, bore the deceased's name, dates, and typically a verse or religious quotation about death and heavenly reward. The cards came in various sizes and qualities, from simple cardstock with plain text to elaborate productions printed on heavy stock with decorative borders, sometimes even incorporating photographs of the deceased. Families ordered these by the dozen or even by the 100, and the undertaker coordinated with printers to produce them quickly, usually within a day or two of death. The markup on memorial cards was substantial. The actual printing cost was minimal, but grieving families rarely questioned the price. Flowers formed yet another revenue stream. Every funeral required flowers, and the grander the funeral, the more elaborate the floral arrangements. The undertaker maintained relationships with florists and often acted as intermediary, arranging for wreaths and crosses and elaborate standing displays to be delivered to the home and the church. White flowers predominated, lilies primarily, but also roses, chrysanthemums, orchids. The scent of these flowers, particularly lilies, became so associated with death that many Victorians could not bear the smell even in happy contexts, finding it too reminiscent of funerals and grief. The undertaker understood this association, but encouraged elaborate floral displays anyway, for they served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the family's wealth and grief, they created visual spectacle, and practically speaking, they helped mask the odour of decomposition. The hearse itself, though owned by the undertaker rather than sold to families, represented another form of funeral furniture, a vehicle designed specifically for death. Victorian hearses were marvels of sombre craftsmanship, large enclosed carriages painted black, decorated with carved wooden scrollwork, fitted with glass sides so that the coffin within remained visible to passers-by. Black plumes of ostrich feathers mounted on the corners waved as the hearse moved, announcing death from streets away. The horses that drew the hearse were equally important. Black stallions, specially trained to walk at the slow measured pace appropriate for funeral processions, fitted with black plumes atop their heads and black caparisons draped over their backs. The most expensive funerals employed 4 horses, or even 6, while middle-class funerals made do with 2. The poor, who could not afford a hearse at all, carried their dead in simple hand-carried coffins. The undertaker employed an entire staff to manage funeral processions. The mutes, men dressed in heavy black cloaks and carrying tall staffs wrapped in black crepe, stood at the door of the house and then walked ahead of the hearse, their presence announcing mourning. They spoke to no one, maintained expressions of sombre gravity, moved with deliberate slowness. They were human symbols, embodiments of grief, hired specifically for their ability to look appropriately sorrowful. The feathermen carried tall plumes of black ostrich feathers, holding them aloft as they walked, creating a forest of dark plumage that marked the procession from blocks away. Pages, young boys dressed in black, walked alongside the hearse or rode on its exterior, adding to the visual spectacle and signalling the family's wealth. For pages cost money, and the more pages employed, the grander the funeral. All of these elements, coffin, fittings, clothing, cards, flowers, hearse, staff, came with price tags, and the undertaker compiled them into funeral packages at various levels. A first-class funeral might cost £70 or more, employing everything mentioned and more besides. A third-class funeral designed for respectable working families could be managed for £5 or £6. The undertaker maintained catalogues and price lists, though he rarely showed these to clients. Instead, he discussed in general terms what would be appropriate for someone of the deceased station, what the family could afford, what would satisfy social expectations. He guided families towards spending what he knew they could pay, sometimes encouraging them to stretch their budgets, reminding them that the funeral was a once-in-a-lifetime event, that skimping would be noticed and remembered. The undertaker's warehouse held all of this inventory. Coffins stacked against walls, fabrics rolled on shelves, brass fittings sorted in drawers, ready-made mourning clothes hanging in rows, stationery boxed and labelled. Walking through these rooms was like touring death's department store, seeing the material culture of grief reduced to products and prices. Every object existed solely for death, had no function except in mourning, no value except to the bereaved. The undertaker was merchant and curator of all of it, knowing exactly what he had in stock, what he needed to order, what would satisfy this family's requirements and that family's expectations. His profit margins were substantial. A coffin that cost him £3 in materials and labour might sell for £12. Memorial cards printed for 6p per dozen might be charged at 2 shillings. The markup on mourning clothing could reach 200%. Families in grief rarely haggled, rarely questioned prices, rarely shopped around. They trusted the undertaker to provide what was needed, to guide them through unfamiliar territory, and there they paid what he asked. This made the funeral trade lucrative, but it also made undertakers targets of occasional criticism. Reformers complained about extortionate funeral costs, about undertakers who preyed on grief, about the pressure families felt to spend beyond their means to avoid social disgrace. The undertakers themselves argued that they provided valuable services, that their goods were fairly priced, that elaborate funerals served important social and psychological functions. The truth lay somewhere between. They were businessmen operating in a market where demand was guaranteed, and customers were emotionally vulnerable, and they did well from it. But for all the profit and all the inventory and all the careful business calculations, the furniture of mourning served a genuine purpose. It transformed abstract grief into concrete action, gave families something to do when death left them helpless, provided ritual structure when emotion threatened to overwhelm. The choosing of a coffin, the selection of memorial cards, the ordering of the mourning clothes, these tasks occupied the bereaved, gave them decisions to make, allowed them to express their love and respect through material means. The Victorians, for all their excess and expense, understood that grief needed form, that emotion without ritual became unmanageable. The undertaker provided that form, sold it itemized and priced, made it available to anyone who could pay, and in doing so he made death bearable, transforming it from biological catastrophe into social ceremony, from ending into transition, from horror into something that could be managed, contained, and finally laid to rest. Chapter 5. The Night Watchers. The candle had burned halfway down its length when the clock in the hall struck 2. In the front parlour, the coffin rested on its trestle, lid open, revealing the still face within. Around it sat 3 women, 2 elderly neighbours and a younger cousin, all dressed in black, all awake though their eyes showed the strain of hours without sleep. This was the 3rd night of watching, and 2 more remained before the burial. The house was silent except for the clock's ticking and the occasional settling of floorboards in the rooms above where the rest of the family slept. Outside, fog pressed against the windows, thick and yellow in the gaslight from the street. The watchers sat without speaking, their presence serving purposes both practical and superstitious, maintaining a vigil that stretched back centuries before the Victorians made ritual of it. The custom of watching the dead had roots in necessity. In earlier times, before undertakers and their preservation techniques, bodies were kept at home for days while word spread and family gathered. Someone needed to sit with the corpse through the night hours to ensure that it remained undisturbed, to guard against rats or other vermin that might be drawn by the scent of death. But the practice also carried deeper meanings, a recognition that the newly dead occupied liminal space, no longer living but not yet properly buried, existing in a twilight state that required human witness. To leave a corpse alone in the dark seemed cruelty and abandonment, as though the deceased might wake and find themselves deserted. So the watch continued, night after night, until the burial finally occurred. Victorian society transformed this practical necessity into elaborate ceremony. The watch became a structured event with its own rules and customs, its own designated participants and prescribed behaviours. Close family members rarely watched. Grief was considered too raw, too overwhelming for them to sit still through long dark hours with the dead. Instead, the duty fell to friends and more distant relatives, to neighbours who could be trusted to maintain proper decorum, to older women who had watched before and knew what was expected. Professional watchers could be hired from the undertaker if the family lacked sufficient acquaintances, or if they preferred to keep the vigil entirely outside family circles. The watchers arrived as darkness fell, entering through the front door which remained unlocked throughout the mourning period. They removed their coats and gloves in the hall, then proceeded to the parlour where the coffin waited. The room had been prepared earlier by the undertaker's staff. Furniture moved to the walls, mirrors covered with black cloth, curtains drawn, candles placed at the head and foot of the coffin. A small table held refreshments, usually simple fare, bread, cheese, cold meat, tea. The watchers were expected to remain through the night, from full dark until dawn, which in winter months meant 12 hours or more of sitting with the dead. They positioned themselves around the coffin, never sitting directly beside it, but always within arm's reach, always where they could see the face clearly. This positioning was crucial, for one of the watch's primary functions was to observe the corpse for any sign of change, any indication that death might not be complete. The Victorian fear of premature burial ran deep, fed by occasional newspaper accounts of bodies that had shown signs of life after being pronounced dead, of coffins open to reveal corpses that had turned or moved, of scratches found on the inside of coffin lids suggesting desperate attempts to escape. The watchers therefore study the face constantly, looking for the slightest movement of eyelid or lip, watching for the rise and fall of breathing, checking that the skin remained the correct colour and temperature. A handkerchief or small mirror was often held before the mouth periodically to check for breath, though by the second or third night of watching, decay had usually progressed far enough to eliminate any doubt of death's finality. The night hours passed slowly. Conversation was permitted, but had to be quiet, respectful, focused on appropriate topics, memories of the deceased, expressions of sympathy for the family, religious reflections on mortality and salvation. Laughter was forbidden, as was any discussion of worldly or trivial matters. The watchers often passed the time in prayer, reciting familiar verses and psalms, their voices barely above whispers in the candlelit room. Some brought needlework or knitting, simple tasks that occupied the hands, while allowing the eyes to remain on the coffin. Others simply sat, hands folded, maintaining their vigil through sheer endurance. The atmosphere in the watchroom carried a peculiar quality, something between reverence and dread. The living sat with the dead in enforced intimacy, separated by only a few feet, sharing air that grew progressively staler and more perfumed with flowers as the night progressed. The candlelight created shadows that moved and shifted with every flicker, making the corpse's face seem to change expression, making still features appear momentarily animated. Watchers learned to distinguish between actual movement and shadow play, between genuine change and tricks of exhausted vision. But the uncertainty remained, the nagging possibility that the corpse might suddenly draw breath, that the eyes might open, that death might not be permanent after all. Practical concerns also occupied the watchers' attention. The room had to be kept at the proper temperature, cool enough to sow decay but warm enough for human comfort during long winter nights. Candles needed regular replacement, for they could not be allowed to burn out completely, leaving the room in darkness. The flowers around the coffin required attention. Wilting blooms removed and fresh ones added from the supply the undertaker had provided. If the corpse showed signs of leaking, fluid seeping through the shroud or coffin lining, the watchers needed to alert the undertaker immediately so he could return and make adjustments. These practical tasks gave structure to the long hours, provided something to do beyond simply sitting and watching. The watchers also served a protective function, though this was rarely spoken of directly. The Victorian underworld included men who made their living stealing from the dead and from those who mourned them. A house in mourning, with its unlocked door and distracted occupants, presented opportunities for theft. Jewellery left on corpses, silver candlesticks, even the brass fittings from coffins, all had value and could be taken by someone bold enough to enter a house of death. The watcher's presence discouraged such intrusions, their wakeful attention ensuring that no one crept into the parlour uninvited. In rougher neighbourhoods, families sometimes hired men specifically for this security function, positioning them at the door rather than in the parlour itself, creating a physical barrier against those who might prey on grief. More troubling still was the threat of body snatchers, the resurrection men who stole corpses for medical dissection. Though the Anatomy Act of 1832 had reduced this trade significantly by providing legal sources of bodies for medical schools, the practice had not disappeared entirely. Valuable corpses, those young and healthy, those who had died of interesting diseases, those belonging to people of note, still attracted the attention of men willing to dig up fresh graves or, more rarely, to steal bodies before burial. The watchers therefore served as guards, their presence in the house making it impossible for anyone to remove the corpse without detection. In areas where body snatching remained a real threat, the watch continued every night until the burial, and sometimes armed men accompanied the coffin to the cemetery and stood guard over the fresh grave until the earth had settled and the threat had passed. Supernatural fears also haunted the watching, though respectable Victorians rarely admitted to such beliefs openly. Folk traditions held that the dead might rise and walk, that spirits lingered near their bodies for days after death, that dark forces might try to claim the soul before it reached its final destination. The watcher's presence in this understanding served to protect both the corpse and the household, to maintain a human barrier against whatever supernatural dangers the night might hold. Prayers were said not just for the deceased soul, but for protection of the watchers themselves, for safety through the dark hours, for strength to face whatever might occur. Religious faith and older superstitions mingled in the watchroom, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. The quality of light changed as dawn approached. The candles burned lower, their flames becoming irregular and smoky. The darkness outside shifted from the absolute black of midnight to the softer grey of pre-dawn. The watchers, exhausted now after their long vigil, remained alert through these final hours, knowing that relief would come soon. When true dawn arrived, when the first clear daylight showed in the gaps around the curtains, the watch officially ended. The watchers rose stiffly from their chairs, their joints protesting after hours of stillness. They took one final look at the corpse, confirming that all remained as it should, that death had not been disturbed. Then they left the parlour, closing the door behind them, and went either home to sleep or upstairs to inform the family that another night had passed safely. The family would then enter the parlour for the day's viewing hours, during which friends and acquaintances would call to pay their respects. The Undertakers' staff arrived to refresh the flowers, to check the corpse's condition, to make any necessary adjustments to cosmetics or positioning. The daytime hours had their own rituals and requirements, but they lacked the peculiar intensity of the night watch, the strange intimacy of sitting in candlelight with the dead, while the living world slept. As the burial day approached, the watches took on increased significance. The final night's watchers carried special responsibility, for they would be the last to sit with the deceased before the coffin was closed forever. Some families requested that particular people serve this final watch: closest friends, most trusted relatives, those who had known the deceased longest and best. These final watchers sometimes spoke to the corpse, offering last words of farewell, expressing sentiments they had not managed to voice while life remained. They might place small objects in the coffin: letters, flowers, locks of hair, photographs. Personal items meant to accompany the dead into the grave. When dawn came and their watch ended, they knew that they would not see that face again, that the next time the coffin moved it would be to the church and then to the cemetery, sealed and final. The undertaker coordinated all of this, maintaining lists of who had watched which nights, ensuring that adequate watchers appeared each evening, providing the candles and refreshments they required. He understood the watch's importance, knew that families judged him partly on how smoothly these vigils proceeded. A well-managed watch with reliable watchers and proper supplies reflected well on his organisation and professionalism. Problems during the watch, candles running out, watchers failing to appear, signs of disturbance or decay, damaged his reputation and might cost him future business. Professional watchers, when employed, came from the undertaker's stable of regular workers. These were usually older women, often widows themselves, who had watched so many corpses that death no longer disturbed them. They arrived punctually, sat through the night without complaint, maintained proper demeanour regardless of the corpse's condition or the room's atmosphere. They knew all the traditions and could answer any questions from family members about proper procedure. They recognised the signs of dangerous decay and knew when to summon the undertaker for emergency preservation work. They were professionals in the truest sense, performing a difficult service with competence and discretion. The undertaker paid them a few shillings per night, a small expense that he marked up considerably when billing clients, but their reliability made them worth employing. The custom of watching the dead would persist well into the 20th century in some regions, though it gradually faded as embalming became more common and funeral homes replaced home-based mourning. But in the Victorian era, the watch remained central to the death ritual, a necessary bridge between death and burial, a way of honouring the dead while protecting both the corpse and the living. The watchers sat through countless dark hours, keeping their silent vigil, maintaining their strange companionship with death. They were witnesses to the last days of the dead in the world of the living, guardians of the threshold between life and whatever came after. And when dawn broke and they rose wearily from their chairs, they carried with them memories of those long nights, of the candle-lit faces and the heavy silence, and the peculiar intimacy of sitting with death while the world slept on, unknowing and undisturbed. Chapter 6. The Procession of Sorrow. The street fell silent as the hearse appeared at the corner. Pedestrians stopped mid-stride, men removed their hats, women bowed their heads. Shopkeepers came to their doorways to watch. Even the usual traffic of carts and carriages halted, drivers pulling to the side to let the funeral procession pass. This was not law but custom, an unwritten rule that all traffic ceased when death moved through the streets. The hearse rolled forward slowly, drawn by 4 black horses whose plumes nodded with each measured step, their hooves striking the cobblestones in a rhythm that echoed off the surrounding buildings like a slow heartbeat. The funeral procession represented the culmination of the undertaker's work, the public display of all his careful preparation. Everything that had occurred privately, the washing and dressing of the body, the preservation work, the nights of watching, now gave way to public spectacle. The procession announced death to the community, demanded acknowledgement and respect, transformed private grief into civic ceremony. Its size and grandeur spoke directly to the deceased's social standing and the family's wealth, creating a hierarchy of death that mirrored the hierarchies of life. A grand procession brought honour to the deceased and reflected well on the family. A shabby or poorly organised procession brought shame. Planning the procession required careful attention to detail and deep knowledge of Victorian funeral customs. The undertaker met with the family days before the burial to discuss the route, the timing, the number of carriages required, the staff to be employed. The route mattered significantly. It should pass the deceased's place of work if possible, travel through respectable streets where the procession would be properly observed, avoid areas where construction or market days might interfere with the solemn movement. The timing had to account for distance, for the slow pace of the horses, for the likelihood of traffic or other delays. A procession scheduled to arrive at the church at 11 needed to depart the house with time enough to cover the distance at funeral pace, usually no more than 2 miles per hour. The procession assembled at the house of mourning according to strict order of precedence. At the front walked the mutes, 2 or sometimes 4 of them, dressed in long black cloaks that swept the ground, their faces composed in expressions of professional sorrow. They carried tall staffs wrapped in black crape, holding them upright like standards. Their role was purely ceremonial. They spoke to no one, acknowledged no one, simply walked ahead of the hearse, creating a barrier of black-clad silence. Their presence announced death from blocks away, gave pedestrians time to prepare their respectful responses. The undertaker selected his mutes carefully, choosing men of appropriate height and bearing, men who could maintain the grave demeanour for the duration of the procession, regardless of weather or circumstance. Behind the mutes came the feathermen carrying their tall plumes of ostrich feathers, black as midnight, mounted on long poles. These plumes cost considerable money. Good ostrich feathers were expensive, and each featherman carried a plume that might stand 6 or 7 feet tall. The number of feathermen indicated the funeral's class. A first-class funeral employed 4 or 6, positioning them around the hearse. A more modest funeral might have only 2, 1 on each side. The poorest funerals dispensed with feathermen entirely. As the men walked, the plumes swayed and nodded, creating a forest of black that drew the eye from considerable distance. Children particularly watched for these plumes, counting them, comparing one funeral to another, learning the gradations of death's social hierarchy. The hearse itself commanded the centre of the procession, a massive vehicle of glass and black lacquered wood, baroque in its ornamentation. Carved wooden scrollwork decorated its corners and edges. Glass panels on all 4 sides allowed the coffin within to be seen, displayed like a museum piece. Black curtains could be drawn if the family preferred privacy, but most left them open, wanting the coffin and its brass fittings to be visible, wanting observers to see the quality of the casket, the richness of the flowers piled atop it. The hearse was the undertaker's showcase, proof of his establishment's quality. A well-maintained hearse with polished glass and gleaming paint reflected professional pride. A shabby hearse with cracked panels or peeling paint suggested a second-rate establishment. The horses that drew the hearse received as much attention as the vehicle itself. Black stallions were preferred, specifically trained for funeral work. These horses learned to walk at the slow funeral pace without constant urging, to maintain steady rhythm regardless of street conditions, to remain calm when surrounded by crowds. They wore elaborate tack, black leather with silver or brass fittings, black plumes mounted atop their heads, black caparisons draped over their backs that hung nearly to the ground. A good funeral horse was valuable, and undertakers who owned superior animals advertised this fact, knowing that families took pride in having their dead drawn by magnificent horses. 4 horses indicated a funeral of the first class, 2 horses suggested middle-class respectability, while a single horse marked a funeral as decidedly modest. Behind the hearse came the mourning coaches, enclosed carriages painted black, carrying the family and close mourners. The chief mourners, widow children, closest relatives, occupied the first coach, its windows curtained to shield them from public view. Subsequent coaches held other family members, close friends, business associates, arranged according to their relationship to the deceased. The number of coaches varied wildly depending on family size and wealth. A great funeral might employ 10 or 12 coaches, an ordinary middle class funeral used 2 or 3. The coaches moved at the same measured pace as the hearse, maintaining proper distance, creating a long black snake of vehicles that stretched down the street. The walking mourners followed the coaches, men in black suits and top hats, moving in loose formation. Victorian custom discouraged women from walking in funeral processions. They were considered too delicate for such public displays, too likely to collapse from grief. They rode in the coaches instead, hidden behind curtains. The men who walked maintained solemn expressions, spoke in whispers if they spoke at all, kept their eyes forward or downcast. Their presence swelled the procession's size, demonstrated the deceased's circle of acquaintance, showed community respect. A man who died friendless and unmourned might have no walking followers at all. A respected businessman or community figure might have dozens. The Undertaker himself usually walked near the hearse, positioned where he could observe the entire procession, ready to address any problems, dressed in his finest black suit, top hat, black gloves, carrying a walking stick with a silver handle. His bearing needed to project both authority and sympathy, competence without coldness. He was stage manager of this elaborate performance, responsible for its smooth execution. If a horse stumbled or a coach fell behind, he had to notice and correct it immediately. If the route encountered unexpected obstacles, he had to make quick decisions about detours. His reputation rested on these processions, on his ability to conduct them flawlessly. The procession moved through streets that had been partially cleared by advance notice. The police were informed of the route and timing, and they ensured that major obstructions were avoided during the relevant hour. Shopkeepers along the route often closed their doors briefly as the hearse passed, a mark of respect that also protected their business from the taint of death, for some believed that death's proximity brought bad fortune, that commercial activity should pause when mortality made its public passage. The silence that accompanied the procession was remarkable, a bubble of quiet moving through the normally chaotic Victorian city. The clop of hooves and the rattle of wheels on cobblestones became the only sounds, punctuated occasionally by the sob of a mourner or the creak of leather harness. Observers along the route responded according to their own social position and relationship to the deceased. Those who knew the family might bow deeply or even briefly join the walking mourners for a block or two before peeling off. Strangers showed respect through simple stillness, through the removal of hats, through momentary cessation of whatever activity had occupied them. To ignore a passing funeral, to continue walking or working or talking as though death were not present, marked a person as ill-bred at best, disrespectful and possibly dangerous at worst. Children were taught from young ages to recognize funeral processions and respond appropriately, to understand that death commanded public acknowledgement. The route from house to church typically covered a mile or more, and at funeral pace this journey consumed half an hour or longer. The slow progress served multiple purposes. Practically, it allowed more people to observe the procession, to pay their respects, to recognize the deceased. Symbolically, it suggested that death should not be rushed, that the final journey deserved dignity and time. Emotionally, it gave mourners in the coaches time to compose themselves, to prepare for the church service that awaited. The Undertaker timed everything precisely, adjusting the departure from the house to ensure arrival at the church at the scheduled moment, factoring in likely delays, building in small margins for unexpected problems. Arrival at the church represented a critical moment, requiring careful choreography. The procession halted in front of the church doors. The mutes and feathermen positioned themselves in lines flanking the entrance, creating an honour guard. The Undertaker's assistants, called bearers, emerged and moved to the hearse. These men, typically 6 in number, were selected for their strength and their ability to move in unison. They wore black suits and black gloves, and they had practiced their movements until they could execute them with precision. Opening the hearse's glass door, they slid the coffin out onto a special frame, then lifted it to their shoulders with smooth coordination. The coffin had to remain level, had to appear to float effortlessly despite its weight, 100 pounds or more with body and elaborate casket combined. The bearers carried the coffin through the honour guard and into the church, moving with measured steps, maintaining perfect synchronization. The mourners followed in order of precedence, filing from the coaches and through the church doors. Inside, the coffin was placed on a bier before the altar, surrounded by the flowers that had been transported ahead. The church service followed familiar patterns: hymns, scripture readings, a sermon or eulogy, final prayers. The undertaker remained outside during the service, supervising his staff, ensuring the horses remained calm, the vehicles stayed positioned properly, everything remained ready for the next phase of the journey. When the service concluded, the process reversed. The bearers lifted the coffin again and carried it back to the hearse. The mourners returned to their coaches. The procession reformed and moved toward the cemetery, which might be a mile away or several miles depending on where the family had purchased their burial plot. The cemetery journey followed the same slow pace, the same respectful silence, though by this point the novelty had worn off and observers along the route might pay less attention. The procession became routine to those who saw it daily in London. Just another funeral among the dozens that occurred each day. Cemetery arrival brought new challenges. The procession had to navigate cemetery gates designed for individual carriages, not long funeral trains. It had to follow winding paths to the correct plot, sometimes travelling considerable distance through the cemetery grounds. At the graveside, the hearse halted and the real burial work began, though this phase happened outside the formal procession and belonged to the gravediggers rather than the undertaker's staff. The procession proper ended at the cemetery gates, its purpose fulfilled, death delivered from the private space of the home to the public space of the church, to the final space of burial. For the undertaker, the procession represented both his greatest challenge and his finest hour. Here, his organisational skills, his attention to detail, his management of staff and equipment all became visible and subject to public judgment. A successful procession enhanced his reputation, led to recommendations and future business. A flawed procession, late arrival, disorganised staff, poorly maintained equipment, any of a dozen possible failures damaged his standing and might cost him clients. He therefore invested heavily in the procession's elements, maintained his hearses and coaches in pristine condition, trained his staff thoroughly, planned routes with obsessive care. The cost of these grand processions was substantial. A first-class funeral with 4 horses, multiple mutes and feathermen, a dozen mourning coaches, and all associated expenses might cost £50 or more, with the procession itself accounting for perhaps half that sum. But for Victorian families, the expense was justified, even necessary. The procession was public proof of their grief, visible demonstration of their respect for the deceased, tangible evidence of their own social standing. To economise on the funeral procession was to announce either poverty or indifference, neither of which a respectable family could afford. So they paid what the undertaker asked, accepted his guidance on proper form, and trusted him to deliver the spectacle that Victorian death required. And through the streets of London and every other English city, day after day, the processions moved in their slow black rivers, carrying the dead to their rest while the living watched and remembered that they too would someday take that final journey through the streets, displayed in glass and flowers, mourned or unmourned, according to what they had been and what they could afford. Chapter 7. The Resurrection Men. The cemetery gate stood open despite the late hour, its iron hinges recently oiled to prevent the squeak that might draw attention. Beyond lay acre upon acre of graves, neat rows of headstones and monuments stretching into darkness broken only by occasional gaslight from distant roads. Near the far wall, where newer graves clustered in unconsecrated ground, 2 men worked with methodical efficiency, their faces masked by cloth against both recognition and the smell of their labour. They had been digging for an hour, working mostly in spellants, their spades biting into soil that was still loose and easily moved. 3 feet down they struck wood, the coffin lid barely 30 hours in the ground. One of the men grunted satisfaction. They were making good time. By dawn they would be miles away, and the grave would show little evidence of disturbance beyond some disturbed earth that rain and foot traffic would soon obscure. And in a cellar beneath a medical college across the city, a professor of anatomy would accept delivery of a fresh corpse, ask no questions about its origin, and pay £10 in cash. The relationship between undertakers and the men who dug up graves was complicated, shadowed by mutual necessity and shared danger. Officially, body snatching was criminal, punishable by imprisonment and public disgrace. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had theoretically ended the trade by providing medical schools with legal access to unclaimed bodies from workhouses and prisons, but the law's implementation was imperfect, and the demand for dissection subjects far exceeded the legal supply. Medical education required hands-on experience with human anatomy, and that required bodies, many bodies, fresh bodies, bodies that showed minimal decay. The resurrection men, as they were sometimes called, filled this gap between legal supply and academic demand. They stole corpses from fresh graves and sold them to anatomists who pretended not to know where their specimens originated. Undertakers occupied an ambiguous position in this economy of the dead. Some maintained strict distance from body snatching, refused any involvement, reported suspicious activity to authorities. These men prided themselves on professional ethics, on protecting the sanctity of their clients' graves. But others recognized opportunity. An undertaker knew which bodies were freshly buried. He knew which graves were watched and which lay unguarded. He knew the cemetery layouts, the patterns of night watchmen, the locations of walls that could be scaled. He possessed tools and a knowledge that made grave robbing considerably easier, and he had access to the bodies before burial, could identify which corpses would be most valuable to anatomists, young adults who died of accidents or acute disease, bodies unmarked by the wasting illnesses that made cadavers less useful for teaching. The involvement ranged from passive cooperation to active participation. At the simplest level, an undertaker might accept payment for information, which grave held a particularly fresh or valuable body, what time the night watchman changed shifts, whether the family had taken special precautions. This information cost him nothing to provide and carried minimal risk. If caught, he could claim he had been tricked or overheard. That he bore no responsibility for what criminals did with publicly observable information. More daring undertakers provided equipment, shovels, ropes, wagons, rented to resurrection men for the night at inflated prices. The undertaker remained physically distant from the crime, but profited directly from it. Some undertakers went further still, actively participating in the exhumations. These men worked in partnership with resurrection gangs, combining the gang's muscle and criminal boldness with the undertaker's knowledge and respectability. The undertaker identified targets, provided intelligence on security measures, sometimes even helped with the actual digging, his funeral trade giving him a plausible excuse for being near cemeteries at odd hours. The profits from this collaboration could be substantial. A steady supply of bodies fetched £200 or more per year, supplementing the undertaker's legitimate income significantly. But the risks were equally substantial. Discovery meant ruin, not just criminal prosecution, but total destruction of reputation and business. No family would employ an undertaker known to traffic in stolen corpses. The resurrection men themselves came from various backgrounds, united by willingness to perform work that most found utterly repugnant. Some were former gravediggers who had turned criminal, applying their professional skills to illegal purposes. Others were simply poor men desperate enough to do anything for money, who had overcome their initial revulsion and learned the trade. A few were career criminals who saw body snatching as lucrative and relatively low risk compared to housebreaking or highway robbery. They worked in small gangs, usually 3 or 4 men, each with a specific role: the diggers, the lookout, the wagon driver. They developed techniques that minimized effort and evidence, becoming remarkably efficient at their grim work. The preferred method involved digging at the head of the grave rather than excavating the entire length. Once the grave was opened, a hole was broken through the coffin lid just above where the head lay. Hooks were inserted, sometimes butcher's hooks, sometimes purpose-made tools, and caught in the shroud or the body itself. The corpse was then pulled out through this relatively small opening, leaving the coffin mostly intact. The grave could be refilled quickly, the disturbed earth at one end relatively inconspicuous, compared to a completely excavated grave. The body, stripped of its shroud, which was returned to the coffin to reduce evidence, was placed in a sack and loaded onto a wagon. From grave opening to departure, an experienced gang could complete the work in under 2 hours. Winter was the preferred season for this work. The long nights provided more darkness for cover. The cold preserved bodies better, making them more valuable to anatomists. Medical schools were in session, creating steady demand. And frozen ground, while harder to dig, created less mess. No mud to track, no soft earth that showed obvious disturbance. Summer brought its own challenges, particularly the rapid decay that made bodies less valuable if even a few days had passed since burial. The resurrection men therefore focused their efforts on the very freshest graves, sometimes stealing bodies that had been in the ground for less than 24 hours. Cemetery security evolved in response to this threat. Wealthier cemeteries employed night watchmen who patrolled the grounds with dogs and lanterns. Some installed alarm systems, iron frameworks called mort safes that enclosed coffins in the ground, or heavy stone slabs that covered graves until the body had sufficiently decomposed to be worthless to anatomists, typically 6 weeks or more. Individual families took their own precautions, hiring guards to watch fresh graves for the critical first weeks, or specifying deep burial 12 feet down rather than the standard 6, making exhumation far more difficult. Some families requested that the coffin be filled with pitch or tar after burial, effectively gluing the body into place and making removal without total excavation nearly impossible. The Undertaker played both sides of these security measures. Legitimately, he advised wealthy families on protecting their dead, recommended mort safes or guard services, buried coffins at extra depth for an additional fee. But with other families, less wealthy families who could not afford extensive security, he might note the vulnerability, might mention to certain contacts that here was a grave that would be easy to rob. This double dealing required careful compartmentalization, an ability to serve clients faithfully, while simultaneously betraying those clients to criminals. The undertakers who managed this balance successfully were men of peculiar moral elasticity, able to justify their actions through financial necessity or simple rationalization that the body's fate after burial was no longer their concern. The medical schools that purchased stolen bodies maintained elaborate fictions of ignorance. Professors asked no questions about where specimens originated. They paid in cash, kept no records of purchases, made no effort to verify that bodies had been obtained legally. Some schools even maintained accounts with specific resurrection gangs, though these arrangements were never documented, operating on trust and mutual interest. The anatomists needed bodies. The resurrection men provided bodies. The undertakers facilitated the exchange. Everyone profited, and everyone pretended that nothing illegal was occurring. Public discovery of body snatching when it happened created immediate scandal. Newspapers ran sensational stories. Families demanded investigations. Police made arrests. Though convictions were rare, the legal framework around body snatching was oddly weak, treating it as misdemeanor rather than felony, imposing fines and brief prison terms rather than serious punishment. The real penalty came through reputation. A resurrection man identified publicly could no longer work. Everyone watched his movements, and cemeteries strengthened security wherever he appeared. An undertaker implicated in body snatching faced complete business collapse. No family would trust their dead to a man who might sell them to anatomists. Yet the trade persisted because it filled genuine need. Medical education could not progress without anatomical study, and anatomical study required bodies. The legal supply remained insufficient throughout the Victorian period despite the Anatomy Act's intentions. So the illegal supply continued, moving through shadowy channels, facilitated by men who understood that death created opportunities for those willing to set aside the squeamishness and conventional morality. The undertaker, standing at the intersection of legitimate funeral trade and criminal body trade, could choose his level of involvement. Some chose absolute distance, others chose limited cooperation. A few chose full partnership, becoming essential nodes in the network that moved bodies from graves to dissection tables. The work took its toll on those who performed it. The resurrection men who did the actual digging and body handling often drank heavily, using alcohol to numb themselves to the horror of their labour. They aged quickly, their health declining from exposure to disease and decay. They lived as outcasts even among criminals, their profession marking them as untouchable, handling the dead in ways that violated fundamental taboos. Some eventually quit, unable to continue despite the money. Others died young, succumbing to the diseases that corpses carried, or to the dangers of working in darkness and secrecy. None grew old in the trade. For the undertakers involved, the psychological burden was different but equally real. They betrayed the trust families placed in them, violated the sacred duty to protect the dead, participated in desecration for profit. Some justified this through economic reasoning. They had families to feed, businesses to maintain, and the body was only an empty shell anyway. The soul having departed, its theft doing no real harm to the deceased. Others simply avoided thinking about it, compartmentalized their activities, maintained firm mental separation between their public professional life and their private criminal activities. A few seemed genuinely unbothered, treating the theft of bodies as just another business opportunity, no different from any other trade in commodities. The relationship between undertakers and resurrection men formed one of the darker threads in Victorian death culture, a reminder that even the most elaborate rituals and expensive preparations could not fully protect the dead. The grave was meant to be final resting place, inviolable and eternal. But in practice, particularly for those of modest means who could not afford extensive security, the grave was only as secure as the night watchman's diligence and the resurrection gang's calculation of risk versus reward. And the undertaker, the trusted professional who had prepared the body and organised the funeral and lowered the coffin into the ground, might be the very person who later provided the information that led to the grave being opened and the body stolen. It was a betrayal that struck at the heart of the profession's supposed principles, yet it occurred often enough to be more than aberration. It was part of the system, a hidden economy that operated alongside the visible funeral trade, enriching some undertakers while compromising the profession as a whole, and reminding everyone that death, for all its ceremony and expense, could not fully escape the mundane reality of supply, demand, and profit. Chapter 8. The Children in Their Boxes. The workshop's back corner held a section that the undertaker preferred visitors never saw. Here, stacked against the wall in graduated sizes, stood rows of small white coffins. The largest measured perhaps 4 feet in length, sized for a child of 8 or 10 years. The smallest was scarcely larger than a hat box, designed for infants who had lived only hours or days. Between these extremes ranged every intermediate size, each representing a different brief span of life cut short. The wood was pine, painted white rather than stained dark, white being the colour of innocence, of purity, of children who died before sin could touch them. The brass fittings were smaller and simpler than those on adults' coffins, but still carefully chosen. Inside, the lining was white satin, sometimes decorated with small embroidered flowers or angels. Everything about these coffins spoke of tragedy made beautiful, of death dressed in innocence's clothing. The undertaker kept this inventory because child death was common, expected, inevitable. In the slums of Victorian London, nearly half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Disease took them in waves. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, sweeping through neighbourhoods and leaving empty cradles in their wake. Tuberculosis consumed slowly, wasting children over months. Cholera killed in days. Accidents claimed their share. Falls, drownings, burns, the 1,000 hazards that surrounded young lives in an industrial city. Even in wealthier households, where sanitation was better and nutrition adequate, children died with distressing frequency. No family was immune. No parent could assume their children would survive to adulthood. The undertaker therefore prepared for child deaths as a regular part of his business, keeping small coffins ready, knowing they would be needed soon enough. The death of a child required different handling than adult death, both practically and emotionally. Practically, the small bodies were easier to manage, to position, to preserve. They cooled quickly after death, and their tissues held up better during the days of lying in state. But emotionally, child death struck parents with a force that adult death rarely matched. The grief was rawer, more absolute, less tempered by the consolations that might ease the loss of an elderly parent or a spouse who had lived a full life. Parents who lost children entered a particular hell of guilt and despair, questioning what they might have done differently, wondering if they had failed some fundamental duty, unable to accept that death had claimed a life barely begun. The Undertaker became counsellor as well as tradesman when dealing with bereaved parents. He needed to guide them through decisions they could barely comprehend, needed to suggest gently what would be appropriate, what would provide comfort, what would allow them to say goodbye in a manner they could bear. Many parents wanted to hold their dead children one last time, wanted to dress them in favourite clothes, wanted to place beloved toys in the coffin. The Undertaker accommodated these wishes while also managing expectations, gently explaining that the child could not be positioned sitting up, that certain toys were too large to fit in the coffin, that extensive handling of the body was not advisable if several days had passed since death. Infant death created its own category of worrow and ceremony. Babies who died within days or weeks of birth were often baptized in emergency ceremonies at home. Given Christian names they would carry into the grave though they had barely lived. These tiny bodies posed special challenges for the Undertaker. They were so small, so fragile, so easily damaged by rough handling. The preservation techniques used on adults had to be scaled down, applied with extraordinary care. The cosmetic work required a lighter hand. Infant skin was thin and delicate, easily marked by the heavy application of rouge or powder. The positioning was simpler, for infant bodies had not yet developed the rigour that made adult corpses difficult to arrange. But the emotional weight was no lighter for the physical ease of the work. The coffins for infants were objects of painful beauty. White painted wood lined with the softest fabric available, sometimes silk, sometimes fine cotton. A small pillow supported the head. Lace trimmed and decorated the edges. Some families requested that religious symbols be added, a small cross, an angel figure, a prayer card. The Undertaker kept supplies of these items, knowing they would be needed regularly. He also kept tiny burial gowns, white christening-style dresses that could be used if the family had none, or if they could not bear to use the gown the child had worn for baptism. Everything had to be perfect, had to honour the brief life, had to give the parents something to remember beyond the simple fact of loss. The viewing of dead children followed different customs than adult viewings. While adults were typically laid out in the front parlour with formal visiting hours, children were often kept in the parents' bedroom, in the nursery, or in some other intimate family space. The viewing was private, limited to close family, not the semi-public event that adult viewings became. Parents might sit for hours with their dead child, holding the small hand, stroking the hair, speaking to the corpse as though it could hear. The Undertaker allowed this, understood that parents needed time to accept what had happened, needed to exhaust their grief before they could bear to release the body to burial. Some parents requested that the child be photographed in death. Post-mortem photography had become increasingly common in the Victorian era, a way of preserving images of the dead before burial erased them forever. For children who had died young, this might be the only photograph the family would ever have. Photography was still expensive, still something done for special occasions, and many families had never gotten around to having their children photographed while alive. The Undertaker coordinated with photographers who specialised in this work, men who knew how to position corpses to look as lifelike as possible, how to prop open eyes or paint pupils onto closed lids, how to use long exposure times to blur away any signs of decay. The resulting images showed children who appeared merely sleeping, dressed in their best clothes, sometimes positioned with toys or flowers, sometimes held in their mother's arms. These photographs became treasured possessions, framed and displayed or kept in albums, tangible proof that the child had existed, had been real, had been loved. The funerals of children differed from adult funerals in scale and symbolism. The processions were smaller, fewer coaches, sometimes only a single carriage following the hearse, but they incorporated elements specific to child death. The coffin was carried by young pallbearers, often girls in white dresses for female children, boys in white shirts for males. White represented purity, innocence, the sinless state of children who died before moral responsibility attached. The hearse might be drawn by white horses rather than black, another symbol of innocence. Flowers were all white, lilies, roses, chrysanthemums, and often arranged in shapes meant to evoke childhood. Crowns, wreaths, occasionally even toys or animals fashioned from white blooms. The burial service for children emphasized different themes than adult services. Rather than focusing on the deceased's earthly accomplishments and relationships, child funerals stressed innocence and divine mercy. Clergymen spoke of children as angels now, of heaven as a place where young souls were especially welcome, of the promise of reunion in the afterlife. These themes offered what comfort theology could provide, though for many parents no theological explanation could adequately answer the question of why their child had died. The undertaker stood at graveside listening to these services time after time, hearing the same words of comfort offered to an endless succession of bereaved parents, wondering if the words helped at all, or if they simply filled the silence that grief created. The cost of child funerals varied as widely as adult funerals, though the absolute amounts were generally lower due to the smaller coffin and reduced scale of the procession. A first-class child's funeral might cost £20. A basic burial could be managed for £2 or £3. But here the undertaker's usual profit calculations ran into a different kind of pressure. Parents who lost children were often desperate to provide the best funeral they could afford, to demonstrate their love through expenditure, to honour the brief life with ceremony and beauty. They might spend money they could not spare, might go into debt to provide a funeral that matched their grief rather than their finances. The undertaker could exploit this desperation, could encourage families to spend beyond their means, could sell them expensive upgrades and additions by suggesting that anything less would dishonour the child's memory. Some undertakers did exactly this, viewing bereaved parents as particularly profitable clients, pushing for elaborate funerals and expensive coffins. Others moderated their business instincts with compassion, gently steering families toward appropriate expenditures, suggesting economies that would not compromise dignity, even occasionally reducing fees for families in obvious financial distress. The profession contained both types, the ruthless profiteer and the compassionate tradesman, and every gradation between. A parent planning a child's funeral had no way to know which type they had encountered until the bills came due. Multiple child deaths in a single family were not uncommon. Disease often swept through households, taking several children in succession. The undertaker might bury 2 or 3 siblings within a month, repeating the same sad rituals, providing the same comfort, selecting coffins from his ready stock with grim efficiency. Some families requested that siblings be buried in the same grave, the coffins stacked or placed side by side, keeping the children together in death as they had been in life. The undertaker arranged this, coordinating with cemetery officials, ensuring that graves were dug large enough to accommodate multiple small coffins. The emotional toll on parents who lost multiple children was immense, often breaking marriages, driving mothers to madness or permanent melancholy, turning fathers cold and distant. The undertaker witnessed this destruction time after time, saw how grief could hollow out families, how the loss of children could damage the living in ways that lasted for decades. He became hardened to it necessarily. If he took on every family's grief as his own, he could not function. But some cases stayed with him. Some parents whose suffering seemed particularly acute. Some children whose brief lives seemed especially tragic. These memories accumulated over years in the trade, creating a burden of sorrow that the undertaker carried silently. For there was no one to whom he could speak of such things. No outlet for the secondary trauma that came from managing death day after day. The Victorian obsession with this elaborate mourning reached its height in cases of child death. Mothers wore black for extended periods, a year or more for a child, sometimes even longer. Mourning jewellery fashioned from the child's hair became common. with locks carefully preserved and woven into bracelets or brooch settings. Memorial cards for children featured particularly sentimental imagery: angels carrying babies to heaven, children asleep in Jesus' arms, verses about reunions in paradise. The Undertaker stocked all of these items, provided them as part of his service, understanding that material objects helped parents process immaterial loss, that having something to hold and see and keep made the vanished child feel slightly less vanished. Some parents could not let go even after burial. They visited graves daily, brought fresh flowers regardless of season or weather, maintained the plots with obsessive care. They commissioned elaborate monuments even for infant graves: stone angels, tiny headstones with carved lambs or flowers, iron railings to mark and protect the burial spot. The Undertaker coordinated with stonemasons to provide these monuments, acting as intermediary between grief and craft. He learned to read the depth of parental attachment in the monuments they requested, learned to distinguish between the grief that would eventually heal and the grief that would never release its grip. The white coffins in the workshop's corner were therefore more than inventory. They were prophecy, evidence of future sorrows that had not yet occurred, but certainly would. The Undertaker looked at those small white boxes and knew that each would be needed, that children were dying at that very moment in homes across the city, that parents were beginning the journey into grief that he would help them navigate. He kept the coffins ready, checked them periodically to ensure they remained in good condition, maintained adequate stock in all sizes. It was among the most depressing aspects of his trade, this preparation for children's deaths, this acknowledgement that innocence and youth provided no protection against mortality. But it was necessary work, perhaps the most necessary work he performed, for if adults could sometimes manage death's logistics themselves, parents who had lost children could not. They needed someone to take control, to make decisions, to handle the unbearable practical details, while they simply tried to survive their grief. The Undertaker provided this service, accepted the burden of their sorrow, carried the small white coffins from workshop to home to grave, and moved on to the next tragedy and the next and the next, in the endless procession of death that defined his profession and his life. Chapter 9. The Fear Beneath the Ground. The coffin lay open in the Undertaker's workshop, but it was not empty. Inside, bolted to the base, was a complex arrangement of metal tubes and wires. A speaking tube ran from the interior up through a hole drilled in the lid, continuing through another hole in the coffin bottom, where it would eventually connect to a pipe rising above ground. Beside it, a wire connected to a spring-loaded bell mechanism, also designed to extend above the surface. Near the corpse's hand would be placed a cord, easily grasped, connected to both systems. The family who had commissioned this installation was paying an additional £15 for the equipment and the specialised burial, but they considered it money well spent. Their father had expressed repeatedly throughout his final illness a paralysing terror of premature burial. He feared waking in darkness, trapped beneath the earth, suffocating slowly in his coffin. These mechanisms were meant to calm that fear, to provide escape should the impossible occur, should death prove to be not death, but merely deep unconsciousness mistaken for mortality. The Victorian fear of premature burial approached the level of cultural obsession. Medical science of the era could not always distinguish between death and certain forms of deep coma or unconsciousness. Stories circulated regularly in newspapers and magazines of apparent corpses that had revived, sometimes on the Undertaker's table, sometimes during the viewing, occasionally even in the grave. A woman in Manchester had reportedly sat up during her wake, terrifying the assembled mourners. A man in Liverpool was said to have been heard screaming from his coffin 3 days after burial, though by the time the grave was opened he had fallen silent again. Whether from genuine death or mere exhaustion, no one could determine. True or exaggerated, these accounts fed a deep anxiety about the fallibility of death diagnosis, about the possibility that one might be buried alive, might wake in the terrible darkness of the coffin, to find oneself trapped and doomed. The medical profession contributed to this fear through its own uncertainty. Physicians in the mid-19th century had limited diagnostic tools. They checked for breath by holding mirrors to the mouth, for heartbeat by placing hands on the chest, for reflexes by pricking the skin with pins. But in cases of profound unconsciousness, these signs could be minimal or absent, leading to misdiagnosis of death. Some conditions, catalepsy, certain drug overdoses, extreme hypothermia, could produce death-like states that might persist for days before true awakening or actual death occurred. Doctors acknowledged these limitations, which only heightened public anxiety. If physicians themselves admitted they could sometimes not distinguish death from unconsciousness, what protection did ordinary people have against premature burial? The Undertaker thus found himself addressing not just death's reality, but death's uncertainties. Clients questioned him constantly about the signs of death, about how long one should wait before burial, about what safeguards could be implemented. He developed standard responses, explanations designed to reassure without making promises he could not keep. He spoke of rigor mortis as definitive proof of death, of the unmistakable changes that occurred in the body hours after death, of the multiple confirmations he himself performed during the preparation process. If he had dressed and positioned the body, if he had worked with cold flesh that showed no breath or heartbeat or response to stimulus, then the family could be certain that death was real. His professional authority lent weight to these assurances, and most families accepted them, finding comfort in his experience and confidence. But some families could not be reassured, could not overcome their fear regardless of medical or professional opinion. For these clients, the Undertaker offered various safety mechanisms, devices designed to allow anyone mistakenly buried to signal for help or to survive until rescue arrived. The speaking tube was the simplest, a pipe running from the coffin interior to above ground, marked by a small headstone or marker, allowing the prematurely buried to call out. The theory was that cemetery workers or visiting mourners would hear the cries and organize immediate exhumation. In practice, most cemeteries were deserted at night and only lightly visited during the day, making it unlikely that anyone would be near enough to hear even the loudest screams. But the presence of the tube comforted families, gave them the sense that they had done something, had provided an escape route, however improbable its use. More elaborate systems incorporated bells. A wire ran from inside the coffin to a bell mounted above ground on a spring mechanism. The buried person could pull the wire, ringing the bell to attract attention. Some systems used multiple bells or flags that would rise when the wire was pulled, creating visible as well as audible signals. The most expensive versions employed a caretaker system. The cemetery hired watchers specifically to listen for these bells, to patrol the grounds, checking for signals, to respond immediately if any alarm was triggered. These positions, called cemetery watch or grave watch, paid poorly and attracted only the most desperate workers, men willing to spend nights walking among graves listening for bells that almost never rang. Other safety devices focused on providing air and time rather than immediate rescue. Air tubes, larger than speaking tubes, allowed fresh air to reach the coffin interior. Some designs incorporated hand pumps that the buried person could operate to draw air down. Others used passive systems, relying on natural circulation. The theory was that with the adequate air, someone prematurely buried could survive for days rather than hours, increasing the chances that the error would be discovered and corrected. Coffins could be fitted with stores of food and water, with candles or small lamps for light, with tools that might allow the buried person to dig themselves out or at least to make noise that would penetrate to the surface. The most elaborate safety coffins became small survival chambers, equipped with everything a trapped person might need for an extended underground stay. The Undertaker installed these systems for families who requested them, though he privately doubted their effectiveness. He had never heard of a case where the mechanisms had actually been used, where someone had rung the bell or called through the tube and been rescued. The few verified cases of premature burial that he knew of had been discovered by accident or by suspicious family members who insisted on exhumation despite official resistance, not by safety systems functioning as designed. But he kept his doubts to himself, for these devices served psychological purposes regardless of their practical utility. They allowed terrified families to feel they had taken precautions, had protected their loved ones against the unthinkable. The peace of mind was worth the expense, even if the actual protection was illusory. The fear of premature burial also affected undertaking practices more generally. The undertaker found himself under pressure to delay burials, to keep bodies above ground for longer periods to ensure that death was absolute and irreversible. Families requested 3-day waiting periods, sometimes even a week. They wanted multiple confirmations of death from different doctors. They asked the undertaker to perform tests, pricking the flesh deeply with needles, applying hot objects to the skin, even making small incisions to verify that no blood flowed. These procedures, which would have been considered bizarre or inappropriate in earlier decades, became routine requests in the 1850s and beyond, driven by the cultural anxiety about living burial. The undertaker accommodated these requests, understanding that they reflected genuine terror rather than mere eccentricity. He pricked and burned and cut as requested, always producing results that confirmed death, for in nearly every case the person was truly dead, and the tests merely demonstrated what he already knew. Occasionally, however, doubt crept in. A body that seemed warmer than it should be after hours in a cool room. A limb that appeared to have shifted position between viewings. A face that looked different, as though some subtle change had occurred. These anomalies were almost certainly explained by normal post-mortem processes. Continued muscle relaxation, gas production to causing movement, changes in tissue coloration, but they planted small seeds of uncertainty. The undertaker found himself checking and rechecking, taking extra time with preparation, being absolutely certain before declaring that burial could proceed. The literature of premature burial proliferated throughout the Victorian period. Edgar Allan Poe's stories exploited the theme masterfully, describing the horror of waking in coffins, the desperate attempts to escape, the slow suffocation in darkness. Medical journals published case reports, some verified and others dubious, of apparent resurrections from death. Pamphlets offered advice on preventing premature burial, recommending waiting periods and safety equipment. Books compiled historical accounts reaching back centuries, creating the impression that living burial was common throughout history and remained a clear and present danger. This literature kept the fear alive, recycled it through new generations, ensured that the anxiety remained fresh, regardless of how rarely actual cases occurred. Some physicians attempted to combat this fear by developing more reliable tests for death. They proposed sophisticated techniques for determining that life had truly ceased, observing the eyes for specific changes, testing for particular chemical reactions, documenting the progression of decomposition. But these technical solutions could not overcome the fundamental problem, which was that early-stage death and certain forms of unconsciousness could present almost identically. Without modern brain death criteria, without EEG machines or sophisticated neurological testing, there remained an irreducible margin of uncertainty. The undertaker understood this, knew that absolute certainty was impossible, that there would always be a tiny chance that what appeared to be death was something else. He simply chose to operate on the reasonable assumption that the chance was so small as to be negligible, that the procedures he followed were adequate, that the bodies he buried were truly dead. The psychological roots of this fear ran deep, connecting to fundamental anxieties about death, consciousness, and bodily autonomy. The idea of waking to find oneself buried alive combined multiple terrors: the loss of control over one's fate, the betrayal by trusted institutions and authorities, the intimate horror of suffocation and confinement, the irony of being killed by the very measures meant to honor one's death. It represented death doubled, death made worse by error, death transformed from natural inevitability into preventable tragedy. The fear also reflected the Victorian era's complicated relationship with death generally, the simultaneous fascination and revulsion, the elaborate rituals designed to contain a death's horror, the recognition that all the ceremony and expense could not fully tame mortality's power. For the Undertaker, managing this fear became part of his professional duty, as important as the physical tasks of preservation and burial. He learned to speak soothingly to anxious families, to provide reassurance through calm authority, to offer the safety mechanisms that gave comfort, even if their actual utility was doubtful. He learned when to be firm, insisting that death was certain despite family doubts, and when to be flexible, accommodating extended viewing periods or unusual verification requests. His reputation depended partly on his skill at managing these anxieties, at guiding families through their fears and toward acceptance of death's reality and finality. The safety coffins and alarm systems gradually fell out of fashion as the Victorian era progressed. Improvements in medical diagnosis made premature burial less plausible. The rise of embalming, which involved arterial injection and drainage of blood, made the possibility effectively impossible. No one could survive having their circulatory system filled with arsenic or mercury compounds. The cultural obsession shifted towards other aspects of death, other anxieties more relevant to the changing times. But during the mid-Victorian decades, the fear of premature burial remained powerful, shaping funeral practices, driving innovation in coffin design, and enriching undertakers who could provide both real services and imagined protections against a fate that terrified while remaining vanishingly rare in actual occurrence. The undertaker installed his tubes and bells, collected his fees, and buried his clients with their elaborate safety systems intact, knowing that in the end, the earth would claim them all regardless, that death would not be cheated by mechanical ingenuity, and that the silent graves would remain silent except in the fevered imaginations of those still living who projected their own fears onto the darkness beneath the ground. Chapter 10. The Silent Inheritance. The fog lay heavy over Highgate Cemetery on a November morning in 1885. The undertaker walked slowly along the cemetery's main path, his boots crunching on gravel, his breath visible in the cold air. He was older now, past 60, his back bent from decades of lifting coffins and bending over preparation tables. His son walked beside him, a young man of 25 who had joined the family business 3 years earlier and was learning the trade as his father had learned it from his own father in the 1830s. They were here to inspect a family vault, to assess what repairs would be needed before another burial could be accommodated. But the undertaker walked slowly, pausing occasionally to look at graves and monuments, seeing in them the record of his working life. Here was the Ashford family plot, where he had buried 3 generations, grandfather in 1847, the eldest son in 1861, the widow just last year. The monument had been expensive when commissioned, black marble with carved angels, but now moss grew in the carved letters and the marble had developed a green patina. The undertaker remembered the widow's funeral, the last of that family line, buried beside her husband after 3 decades of widowhood. No one had visited the grave since, for there were no descendants left to tend it. The Ashfords had vanished into history, leaving only this stone and the undertaker's memories of their funerals. Further along stood a row of smaller monuments, children's graves from the cholera outbreak of 1854. The undertaker had buried 23 children in a single week that summer, working without rest, and so running short of small white coffins, purchasing additional supplies from competitors when his own stock was exhausted. He could still remember specific faces, a girl of 6 with red hair, a pair of twin boys not yet 2 years old, an infant who had lived only 3 days. The parents were mostly dead themselves now, the survivors scattered or remarried, or simply gone from the neighbourhood. But the small white stones remained, marking brief lives that the undertaker had helped ease into the ground. The Victorian funeral trade had changed remarkably over the undertaker's working lifetime. When he had started in the 1830s, most funerals were simple affairs, a wooden coffin, a brief ceremony, burial in the churchyard. The undertaker had been closer to a carpenter than to the professional he later became, building coffins to order and providing limited additional services. But as the decades passed, expectations had risen steadily. Families demanded more elaborate coffins, more sophisticated preservation, more ceremony and spectacle. The undertaker had adapted, learning new techniques, acquiring new equipment, hiring more staff. His business had grown prosperous, allowing him to purchase a proper shop with street frontage, to maintain a stable of horses and hearses, to employ half a dozen assistants and bearers. But success had brought its own burdens. The work had grown more demanding, more complex, more emotionally draining. The simple carpentry of his early years had given way to elaborate cosmetic work, chemical preservation, management of large funerals with dozens of participants. The relationship with clients had changed. They expected more, questioned more, demanded services and guarantees that earlier generations would never have considered. The undertaker spent increasing amounts of time on consultation and planning, less time on the actual physical work of preparing bodies. He had become more businessman than craftsman, managing finances and staff, negotiating with suppliers, maintaining the reputation that brought clients to his door, rather than to competitors. The trade itself had become crowded. When the undertaker had started, London had perhaps 50 undertaking establishments. Now there were hundreds. Competition fierce, price wars common. Some undertakers cut corners, used cheap materials, provided minimal service while charging maximum prices. Others tried to distinguish themselves through quality and reliability, but the public could not always tell the difference until too late. The profession had developed a somewhat questionable reputation. Undertakers were seen as profiteers, as men who exploited grief, as necessary but not quite respectable. This bothered the undertaker more than he admitted, for he took pride in his work, in the skill and care he brought to it, in the comfort he provided to grieving families. The physical toll had been substantial. His hands were marked by decades of contact with chemicals and corpses, the skin roughened, the fingers slightly bent from arthritis, chemical burns scarred across the knuckles. His sense of smell had been damaged by years of breathing preservative compounds and the odours of decay. He tired easily now, needed assistance with tasks he had once performed alone. The work that had seemed manageable at 30 felt overwhelming at 60. He knew he could not continue much longer, that retirement approached whether he was ready or not. This was why his son now walked beside him, learning the trade, preparing to take over. The younger man had initially resisted, wanted a different life, saw the undertaking trade as grim and limiting. But family pressure and economic reality had prevailed. The business represented capital, an established client base, a steady income. To abandon it would be foolish, wasteful. So the son had joined, spent his days in the preparation room learning to position corpses and apply cosmetics, accompanied his father on client consultations, gradually assumed more responsibility for the business's operation. But the undertaker wondered what future his son faced. The trade was changing in ways that suggested larger transformations ahead. Embalming, which had been rare and expensive in the 1850s, was becoming more common, more sophisticated. American techniques were being imported, involving arterial injection and specialized equipment that required significant investment. Cremation, still illegal in England, was being discussed as a possible alternative to burial, particularly in crowded cities where cemetery space grew scarce. Some reformers called for complete restructuring of the funeral trade, for fixed prices and standardized services, for removal of the profit motive from death management. The undertaker saw in these changes a potential end to the Victorian way of death, the elaborate rituals and expensive ceremonies that had defined his career. If embalming became universal, if cremation was legalized, if reform movements successfully simplified funerals, what would become of undertakers like himself? Would there still be a place for the skills he had developed over decades, the knowledge of preservation and cosmetics and ceremony? Or would the profession be transformed into something unrecognizable, stripped of its craft aspects and reduced to mere logistics. He kept these concerns to himself, did not burden his son with worries about a future neither could control. Instead, he taught what he knew, passed down the techniques and knowledge accumulated over 50 years in the trade. How to read a corpse's condition, what chemicals worked best for different types of preservation, how to handle difficult clients, how to maintain professional dignity while performing undignified tasks, how to price services competitively while maintaining profitability, how to build relationships with clergy, cemetery officials, monument makers, all the network of professionals whose cooperation the undertaker required, how to compartmentalize, to leave the day's death behind when returning home, to maintain some barrier between the constant exposure to mortality and one's own life and family. They reached the family vault and the undertaker produced a key, unlocking the iron gate that sealed the entrance. Inside, the vault was dry and cool, its air stale but not foul. Stone shelves held a dozen coffins, stacked according to date of death, the oldest dating to the 1790s when the vault had been constructed. The undertaker inspected the structure carefully, checking for water damage, for any signs of collapse, for the integrity of the oldest coffins which would need to be moved if new burials were planned. This kind of practical assessment formed the everyday work of his profession, unglamorous but essential, requiring technical knowledge and careful judgment. His son watched and learned, asked questions about structural concerns and load-bearing capacity, about how to determine if a vault could safely hold additional coffins. The undertaker answered patiently, knowing that this mundane knowledge, vault construction, grave dimensions, soil types, cemetery regulations, was as important as the more dramatic skills of body preservation and funeral management. The profession required master of 100 small technical matters, each learned through experience, each contributing to successful practice. As they left the vault and walked back toward the cemetery gates, the undertaker thought about all the bodies he had handled across his career. Thousands, certainly. Perhaps 10,000 or more if he counted every corpse he had touched in some capacity. Rich and poor, old and young, men and women and children, victims of disease and accident and violence and simple old age. He had seen death in every form, had handled bodies in every state of preservation and decay. The work had marked him permanently, had shaped his understanding of life and mortality in ways that those outside the profession could never fully comprehend. He had learned that death was the great equalizer only in the most abstract sense. In practice, death maintained all the hierarchies of life. The rich died in comfort and were buried with honour. The poor died in squalor and were buried cheaply. The bodies might all decay at similar rates once in the ground, but the journeys to that ground remained vastly different. He had learned that grief came in many forms, that some people mourned genuinely and others performed grief as social obligation, that the depth of family, sorrow could not be measured by funeral expenditure. He had learned that the living feared death less than they feared its physical manifestations, the decay, the meltwater, the visible proof of mortality's work. His job had been to shield the living from these realities, to present death in acceptable form, to create the illusion that the dead were merely sleeping. He had learned that his profession occupied a strange position in society, necessary but not quite respectable, well paid but not prestigious, intimate with every family's grief but never fully trusted. He had been invited into homes at their moments of deepest sorrow, had been granted access to the most private spaces and the most vulnerable emotions. But he had never been confused with a friend. He was the undertaker, the death merchant, the man who profited from loss. Families needed him, paid him, thanked him for his services, but they were relieved when his work was done and he departed, leaving them to their grief without his professional presence as a reminder of what had occurred. The sun had burned through the fog by the time they reached the cemetery gates. The undertaker paused, turned to look back at the acres of graves stretching up the hillside. Somewhere among those thousands of monuments were hundreds that marked his work, bodies he had prepared and buried, families he had served. This cemetery and a dozen others like it contained the record of his career, the physical evidence of decades spent managing death. When he himself died, when his own body lay on the preparation table, handled perhaps by his son or by another undertaker if his son could not bear to perform that final service, he would join this company of the dead, would become one more body in one more grave, tended briefly and then forgotten as new deaths demanded attention. His son waited patiently, ready to return to the shop where 2 bodies awaited preparation and 3 families had appointments to discuss funeral arrangements. The work continued, never ending, for death never took holidays. The undertaker turned away from the cemetery and walked toward the waiting carriage. His back ached, his hands hurt, his mind was tired. But the work would remain as long as people died and needed someone to manage their passage from deathbed to grave. The Victorian age of elaborate death ritual might not last forever. The grand funerals and expensive ceremonies might give way to simpler practices, but death itself would not change, would not become less final or less universal. And as long as death occurred, someone would need to handle the bodies, to guide the grieving, to maintain the boundary between the living and the dead. The undertaker had done this work for 5 decades. His son would do it for decades more. And after his son, perhaps a grandson, continuing the silent inheritance that passed from one generation to the next, the burden and the skill of managing mortality in all its difficulty or necessity. The carriage rolled away from Highgate, carrying the 2 men back toward the city, back toward the workshop where corpses waited and families grieved and the endless cycle of death and burial continued without pause. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing a pale November sun that cast long shadows across London streets. In houses throughout the city, people lay dying, would be dead within hours, would become the undertaker's business before the day ended. Such had it always been. Such would it always be. The trade of death continued, silent and necessary, profitable and burdensome, respected and reviled, the work of men who stood at the threshold between worlds and helped the dead cross over, while the living watched and wept and eventually returned to their lives, leaving the undertaker to close the coffin, seal the grave, and wait for the next death, the next family, the next body that required his peculiar expertise and his careful, practiced hand. The candle burned low, the workshop fell silent, the tools lay clean and ready for morning's work. Outside, the city slept, though somewhere in the darkness another family gathered around a deathbed. Another life approached its end. Another undertaker would soon be summoned to begin the ancient work of preparing the dead for their final rest. The Victorian age of death would pass, as all ages pass, but the trade itself would endure, transforming but never disappearing, for death remained constant and those who died required someone to care for them, someone to bear witness, someone to carry them from the light into the darkness of the grave. And so the undertakers continued, generation after generation, the corpse whisperers, the death merchants, the masters of mortality's grim craft, performing their necessary work in the shadows of society, neither celebrated nor fully condemned, simply present, always present, whenever death arrived and demanded its ceremony, its ritual, its professional management. The Victorian undertaker and his ghastly craft had shaped how an entire society confronted death, had created the template for modern funeral practice, had established death as an industry, a profession, a specialized knowledge. And though the specific practices would change, though the chemicals and techniques would evolve, though the elaborate ceremonies would eventually simplify, the core work remained unchanged. Preparing the dead, comforting the living, managing the terrible transition from life to absence, from presence to memory, from breathing flesh to silent dust. The gas lamp flickered once, then steadied. The night deepened, and in the quiet darkness of the workshop, among the coffins and the tools and the bottles of preservative, the history of Victorian death rested, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be understood, waiting to reveal its secrets to those willing to look into the shadows and see what the undertaker saw, what the undertaker knew, what the undertaker carried with him through all his years of service to the dead and to those who mourned them. The story ends here, as all stories end in silence and in darkness. Sleep well, dear listener, and when you wake, remember that death, for all its horror and its mystery, is managed by human hands, by human skill, by human compassion, working alongside human commerce. The Victorians understood this, embraced it, built an entire culture around it, and the Undertaker stood at its centre, silent and skilled, the whisperer to corpses, the guide through grief, the professional master of mortality's requirements. Rest now. The night is quiet. The dead are at peace, and the Undertaker's work is done.